Got it.
So as we reviewed all of the papers and planned for this evening, we saw 7 themes, and these are certainly not comprehensive of Mary's career, but that emerged from the presentations. And we'd like to devote some time to each of those. They are the interpretive approaches to archaeology, Mary's role as a trailblazer in many ways, her outstanding and innovative work with small finds and object biographies, her passion for the archaeology of foodways, as well as cooking and dining with people, her work on landscape, her approach to archaeology as an inclusive practice that includes underrepresented and silenced peoples, and finally, her contributions to comparative colonialism. So we'd like to start with each, we'll go through each of these one by one. We have, maybe 5 to 10 minutes that we can devote to each of them, as well as taking time for any other questions or comments that you would like to make. So let's start with interpretive archaeology. Mary was certainly one, in my opinion, one of the most important proponents and guides to taking interpretive approaches in historical archaeology. I think of her article with Steve Mrozowski and Lauren Cook, going back to 1991 on artifacts and active voices. That certainly had an important impact on me and on, I know, on others of my generation. Her piece on ethnography in retrospect, that historical archaeology is in fact an ethnographic practice. And the book that she co-published in 2013, Interpreting the Early Modern World. I think her work really challenged the kind of processual positivism and hypothesis testing that people like Mary and I were trained in as archaeologists in the 70s, as well as challenging the essentialism and reductionism of the early Marxian approaches in historical archaeology. She argued that we embrace and consider the messiness of all the kinds of data that are available to us as historical archaeologists, and to remember that ultimately our goal is to try and understand people, and that led her into some pioneering work in storytelling as well. So with that introduction, I'd like to open it up to anyone who would like to speak to Mary's work as an interpretive archaeologist. I'll give people a minute to think before I jump in with additional or with particular questions.
I'll just say, in listening to Steve Mrozowski's paper today, that it strikes me how well they complemented one another, even though they had very different approaches. And I remember very specifically that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said she was great friends with Justice Scalia, even though they had diametrically opposite views. And it was all about collegiality. And but it's more than that. It's that you need the opposite, I think, in order to define your own position. And so I think that for Mary and Steve, but for all of us, that had a profound impact on the way that we think about doing archaeology.
I think so. Certainly the work in Lowell that they did together is, it's clear evidence. As I was going through her CV, thinking about some of the publications I kept running into, Lowell. Certainly one of her major areas. Yeah, Dave, please.
I'll jump in for a minute because I've been working with Mrozowski a lot, and he's not here to speak for himself at the moment. So, I'll put some words in his mouth. He wouldn't mind. It's funny. it's interesting what Karen said about opposition. I would say more dynamic tension. I think the two of them would gang up on other people perfectly happily, and not didn't so much see each other as actually proponents of something different, but more in a dynamic tension with each other. And Steve frequently to this day describes that as his most productive partnership ever, because of the fact that they just pushed each other to try and kind of in a kind of competitive mode to kind of work through all of the various sources of data that they were encountering in Lowell, and that were kind of informing some of the things that they were doing. So it's you know, I am kind of putting words in his mouth a little bit, but I've heard them straight from him, and he very much thinks of it as a very productive tension, in the sense of someone who's willing to challenge your ideas and push you to clarify your thinking, and argue your point a little bit. That was something I always felt a little bit with my work with Mary. You know, she was willing to accept the argument if it was well presented. So, you know, the notion of kind of challenging the interpretation a little bit.
It's a great point. As I was looking at the papers, I was also again thinking, Laura, about your presentation and your focus on storytelling, and I was wondering if you were thinking about if you could talk a little bit about the way that Mary helped you, and you think helps all of us to try and best tell truthful stories of the past, as you put it in your presentation.
Sure, and I apologize for the soundtrack. It's bath time right now at home. You know, it's kind of funny because I don't remember Mary ever, you know, saying this is like a narrative style you need to explore, or this is something you need to do. It's almost like her influence just sort of makes it all seep in, or made it all seep in. And so I don't know. I think it was more just the listening to her, reading her work, and getting a sense of what was important. And it's something that's almost just unconscious, and in instilling values. And then you start to see the stories come out when you're not even looking for them. I don't know if any of you have had similar experiences, especially, you know, those of us who are Mary students for a number of years.
I'm actually gonna, I'm gonna jump in on that for a second. And I know that we had talked about an order that we were gonna do it, but I just wanna skip Trailblazer for 1 second and go to Small Finds, because that really does, what Laura said really does lead into that. And so I do remember years in Boston working down in the basement of Bay State Road when we would wash and clean the artifacts and count them. Mary would come in, drop and literally peer over our shoulder and it always found something or point out something that I never saw in like the thousands of pieces of glass that I was washing. So when you're Liz, you know, you're the Pilgrim box. So when you're looking at that, I kind of equate what Laura was just talking about with the Pilgrim box in a way. Do you think that her keen interest and enthusiasm for the artifact collection or a small find instilled in you the curiosity just because you were around her, not because she told you to, as Laura said?
Completely,
and fascination that brought that, you know, that you brought to life in your presentation, and that this box has its life stages.
I mean, it was exactly as Laura was describing, and I was sort of shocked when I put the paper together to find out how influential Mary was. I mean, I didn't even know it myself, reflecting on it. So that was like, I really, I don't know who I thought I was inventing all this myself, but then, you know, when I put it together, I thought, geez, this is like a chip off the old block, you know, and it's looking at the different, you know, objects in themselves, and then what do they mean as a collection, and then deep dives into all the background of each and possible meaning of each object in multiple different ways, and all the stories that are connected. But yeah, it was exactly that. It kind of, how did that happen? You know, I sort of reflect on that. How did that happen? How did that build up over time? Because I've been kind of disconnected, you know, directly from Mary for quite some time now. And this wasn't a specifically, it's an analysis of an object and collection of objects, but it's a museum piece. It's not an archaeological, you know, find, so to speak. So it was a very interesting exercise actually for me to do this. And I felt quite moved actually by the end of it to think about how connected that I am to Mary.
Well, it would be similar, I guess, for you, Jessica, and Carolyn and Christina aren't here, but you all were looking at sort of small finds, and Jessica, you've even gone even further to look at big collections of small finds, and your work in New York. Do you feel that the same way?
Absolutely. I think the way that Laura framed it is absolutely spot on. I think for me, I keep returning to the small find, not intentionally, but I find myself comforted by it. But I think particularly in the urban context, I think I find it so thrilling to be able to find individuals or focus. It provides a point of focus in the vastness of the collections that we have, particularly from Lower Manhattan, and the storytelling is not something that I naturally fall into, but I find myself seeking out the biographies, and I think, and for me, and I kind of address this in my piece, but it's the ability of the singular object to highlight multiple subjectivities, which is absolutely thrilling to me. And I think that gets a little bit towards the inclusiveness in archaeology, but being able to see the hidden lives and the perspectives. And I've often used the analogy of, you know, it's that textile that you start pulling the thread and then suddenly, you know, the whole narrative is unraveling. And I think that comes from a permission that Mary gave in my own questions and in my own research. And I think that, and I agree, I absorbed it unconsciously in terms of understanding how material objects can link to lives and frame lives. So I was very much shaped by her syllabi and the reading lists, and I didn't appreciate where they were taking me. And I think it gives a common language. I mean, I think the fact that Carolyn and Christina and I were able to come together around this, and yes, it's a shared language between all of us. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't Mary's student, but I remember that first and well, the second, especially storytelling session that Adrian and Mary organized, which is very much inspired by Mary. And, you know, I remember feeling just really challenged to explore this fictionalization, right? This acknowledged fiction. Right, knowing that there's always elements of fiction in what we're writing, but that to be honest about it, to be open about it, and to explore the limits of it was incredibly challenging. A challenging thing to do, but also just a wonderful challenge to get, you know, to have placed in front of you that I really attribute that whole inspiration for that approach to the influence that Mary's work had to me up to that point in my career.
I do think her enthusiasm is what sucked you in here at the time, you know? I mean, she had a very dry way of saying something, but she repeated it a couple of times. So you knew it was something to really, first of all, you didn't really pay attention until, like the third or fourth time she repeated it to you. And then all of a sudden you realized, oh, maybe, and then, the light went off and then all of a sudden there was a paper written, and then you were reading the paper and you were standing in a conference with your hands shaking because, she just kind of kept pushing you to that enthusiasm, get it out there, let everybody know. So, that sort of thing leads to sort of her life as a trailblazer in archaeology.
Yeah, and before we turn to that, I would just follow up, Sarah, by also saying that I see the legacy of Jim Dietz in that as well, right? Is that in the same ways he made that? I mean, that's always how I've described my class with him, right? Was that he made the light bulbs go on that had never been on before, as excitement and his love and his passion, and also just this new way and different way of looking at things. And I think Mary really successfully continued in that vein, in that legacy, that intellectual legacy, I would say. So Mary was a trailblazer in a lot of different ways, certainly in developing this interpretive archaeology, as we were talking about. Another area is the legacy that she has left for women in the field, both literally in the field and figuratively, and her constant advocacy and commitment to mentoring women and advocating historical archaeology and being committed to the profession and encouraging all of us to serve the profession. And here I know her students can speak better than I to the way that she instilled in you this sense that it's important to give back. It's important to serve. She had this enduring interest rate in historical households, which is a place where we can understand, especially where we can understand the actions and the importance of women, from one of her early articles in 1984 on archaeology in the historical household, to her Beyond the Walls book in 2015. So I would certainly welcome others of you to speak to ways that you see her career, her contributions as really trailblazing. And I will sit in this moment of quiet. I will just say to Julie and Tricia's paper, where they comment about the fact that they didn't realize the extent of her impact as a trailblazing woman until they started to look back on her work in the 1970s. And as a colleague and a classmate of Julie's, I felt exactly the same way, that I didn't realize it at the time, that what she was doing was really so different, so much of a struggle, and such important work.
Well, I can tell you, I want to say that watching her struggle to get tenure was an eye opener for any of her graduate students as to what women were facing in the field at the time, and still are to a large degree. To see the work that she was doing, to see her accused of not having established an international reputation in social history, when she was cited repeatedly by scholars in Britain and Australia and Canada. And she was not hired to be a social historian. She was hired to teach archaeology, and that's what she had an international reputation with. But to see the attempts to devaluate her work, it was, well, I can tell you personally, it was disgusting, but it certainly was an eye-opener.
I think that Julie, you have yours and Tricia's paper was also talked about,
Very much, yeah.
the contributions in her field work.
We were working on that paper. We went down to William and Mary. It was like a, nostalgic trip. And it turned out that a lot of images and field notes from the projects that she did in the 70s, not hers, but other people running the projects, were contributed to SWEM Library, which is the library at William and Mary, not to an archaeological repository, which I don't understand, but to, and it also included artifacts. So we went down to SWEM Library, and reading what was in those notes, you almost think maybe you guys should have read these notes before you contribute them, because people like Tricia Sanford and Julie King are going to get a hold of it. And when we read some of the stuff that was said in journals, it was pretty shocking. And it was pretty shocking, of course, from 2022 or 2021, which was when we were working on this last summer. And so it really did. I mean, it gave me an incredible appreciation because, from where we sat, she was like the epitome of coolness. And we wanted to read and do what she did. And then to see this whole other strain of, people working against what she was trying to achieve. I'll also say that some of her early papers were very much involved with the Stanley South artifact pattern. So she could count and quantify with the best of them, right? And I don't think that she actually ever really thought that quantification was bad, but that quantification had come to stand for people, and that's what really annoyed her. If you ever get to William and Mary, go to SWEM and look up the records.
Will do.
I know what you mean by that, because I think that she used to always tell me that, artifacts didn't walk over here on their own. So let's talk a little bit more about, what they were doing, or, why they're here, not just so yeah. So anyway.
Well, the next topic on our list here is foodways and cooking. And that's really Karen's domain. So Karen, we're going to ask you to kick us off of our conversation.
Well, so sorry, I'm going to do my best scholarly look here so I can actually read my notes. I said to Luann and Sarah the other day, if it's only Conrad and me, do I ask myself my question, or could they kindly send it and ask it of me? But when I looked at the papers again today, and it had been a couple of, almost 2 months, right? So I was surprised, actually. I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised to really see how foodways came into a lot of papers. And I noted that Travis was talking about the centrality of foodways in their interpretations of an enslaved household and a household during Reconstruction. And it wasn't just a way to make the exhibit more engaging for the public, but really express this idea of the centrality of food and food as embodied experience. And Jimena and Andres also talked about the intimate economies in, I think it's the South Shetland Islands, very remote, how the sealers were able to procure food and clothing and other things. When I think about this, and of course Conrad's paper and my own paper, I'm just struck again by this idea of the meal as a total social fact, or a total event that shows so much about the surrounding society and culture, because it's connected in so many ways. And her ideas of assemblages of practice, I think it really resonated with me in ways that I hadn't really begun to appreciate until some graduate students started asking questions about how best to think about households and kitchens and food in an area of archaeology where people were still building ceramic lists, typologies and things, and not thinking about foodways or households. This idea of things as vibrant as opposed to static objects. And so I'm wondering, for any of you who have, we always have the remains of food and in theory meals in our archaeological collections. So to what extent have you been able to start thinking about those separated artifacts, those broken bits of glass and bone and seeds that Mary's talking about in her article, as representative of a larger of human activity on a larger scale, an activity that's connected to a whole range of social and cultural interests. So that was a very long-winded question, but I'd be curious to know if anybody's beginning to grapple with this idea of food as something more than subsistence, but an activity and a social and cultural activity at that.
I think one of the things that struck me, as I was thinking back about Mary's career, and that her consistent, throughout her career, interest in the household and domestic life, and that we were all growing up thinking or being taught that this was women's sphere, and therefore, right, it wasn't as important as men's activities. And I felt like she just came to own that. That whole area, the study of historical households and people, and to raise the level of significance of that work. And I think that talking about these larger systems also was a way that she was pushing using food as a way to connect the household to these larger systems in ways that also showed the significance and power and importance of women. That's certainly not, was not her exclusive contribution there, but I think that's one of the things that I think of when I think about the way that she worked with households and food and then moved beyond.
I almost look also at, food as an artifact, and almost like Liz did with her life stages. It's almost like the life stages of a meal as you go through, or like, when you're looking at an artifact, there's so much to see in an artifact. Well, there's so much to see in the whole, in whether it's cooking food, presenting food, eating food, something like that. So I see the different stages, and I think that, she had a different way of always looking at something, and but still bringing you back to that same sort of thing, whether it's a small find, whether it's a meal, whether it's a landscape or something like that. She found all those sort of connections.
Well,
Right, they really serve as building blocks for
I think
the kinds of
I think with everything, she was looking for the ways that culture intersected with these things in the past, and the ways that that they achieved significance for people. And I think that was a key thing. And that was one interest, I think, in foodways, because it's one of the most culturally bound up aspects of life, certainly of daily life. And I think she was looking for that. She was looking for those connections.
And honestly, I think I think a lot of archaeologists are comfortable picking one of these data sets and trying to make connections to larger systems. But I think one of the really amazing things was her ability to mix all of these data sets into a mosh-up of a meal and put them in service with each other. And that remains so underdeveloped, especially in all the foodways stuff. Almost nobody is actually like putting food on the plate still. Like that still remains like so underdeveloped, despite her willingness and ability to like put the food and the cutlery and the and the plates all together in a sensory experience for us. Like, not a lot of people are able to do that. That's still like way in the future to have that really fully developed and realize the kind of direction that she set out there. So, that's a challenge for all of us going forward.
Yeah, I know that's something that is always in my mind when I'm just, working on data collection and thinking about, how I'm going to do sampling, if I'm going to collect soil samples for botanical sampling, which is not super standard in the Chesapeake. And I understand why after, just collecting, a couple hundred liters from last summer, but I'm so inspired by, the work she did. And I'm like, it takes so much work to be able to put those data sets together, but it's so inspiring to see what you can do with it. And it's something that's always in my mind when I'm moving forward with projects.
I think that speaks to, Luann, what you mentioned about how Mary always brought, that ultimately our work is about humans. And I think that that's what the synthesis, I've just lost all of my capacity to use words, but essentially, right? It's that to bring all of these different data sets together are ultimately about that human experience, and it always comes back to us and how we engage with food in that sensory aspect. But yes, and I find myself saying this to students that ultimately we are about humans and understanding humans. So I think that is something that I didn't appreciate until further reflection is one of Mary's legacies, but that ultimately we are about humans. So all of these artifacts are our ways of just understanding ourselves in different ways.
I was wondering, I know some of you, certainly Sarah, have worked extensively on Spencer Pierce Little. For me, that was one of the, just conversations with Mary and reading her publications that are sort of struggle with publications about that site. That was one of the places where she was trying to figure out and push herself to start to bring all of those things together. I don't know, with those of you again who work with her at SPL, felt that's what
a lot of us. There
were a lot of you.
I remember the first year I ran it, there was David Landon working there, and Karen Matheny came. So yeah. But at Spencer Pierce Little, she was still struggling to look at the landscape. And she was also trying to look, one of the things that she tried to instill in people was not just to say, okay, let's dig up as much as we can, throw it in the room and try to clean it up and see all the great artifacts we found. We were working together to try and look at, hey, this is a farm. Let's look at it as a farm. The farm is an artifact too, and the farm has its own life. So, it's not just gathering all the stuff, there's a whole more to the landscape that can, tell you things than just how many, sherds you can dig up this afternoon, and if you can find 18th century, 19th century, or 20th century, but with that, I do remember, her constantly walking around and looking over everybody's shoulder there at Spencer Pierce Little House to try and interpret what was going on this side of the house versus what we were digging on that side of the house. So she was trying to look at a bigger picture there, and as I said, that's where she and I sort of went together. Oh yes, the farm, because sometimes you can't see with the artifacts the changes that somebody makes, but you can on the landscape. So
yeah, well, and also just that a farm is about food. So
there it is.
That productive system, right? That's beyond just the ceramics that we eat it on.
So, and one of the things that I found interesting is in a lot of the papers and in discussing Mary with a lot of people over the last couple of years, one of the things that comes out is just how people love to share a meal with Mary, and how she made it a larger experience, whether it was just going over to the pub for some, snacks and some drinks, or whether it was later on, her going through a whole, sit down fancy meal that she was putting together, or, just some, oysters at an SHA meeting. But Karen, I know that that's something that you've probably experienced a lot with Mary, is just the different types of, how a meal gets done.
Not with Mary, which is, I think, really, this has been striking for me, listening to all of the papers and all of the recollections. I had little kids, and I went home when I was done with my office hours and my classes, and I was bringing my kids up, and she respected that. I was called on the carpet by other people for when my babysitting arrangements fell through and I had to bring my son to class. We're still trying to figure out if that's why he could spell Australopithecus at such a young age. But, so it's been really interesting for me to hear about all of these activities and just sort of vicariously share in them, because I realize how much I wasn't involved with, and really was disconnected from. But so it's really exciting for me to hear that. But I think, for me, it makes sense to me what you're all talking about, that she began to think about how to synthesize all of these assemblages. And this concept of assemblages of practice works in so many ways, whether it's the farm, or food production, or dining, or sewing, or whatever the activity is. And so to me, that's the building block that I'm most grateful to have, that I can think about food, but think of it more broadly as foodways, and think about the connections between these objects, and tell the story, make them active.
Felt like every object is an immersion experience, that dealing with every object is this immersion experience that just needs to take you in all these different directions.
I go backwards for 1 second to a landscape archaeology and
Oh,
Spencer
no, that's
Pierce.
going forward. We're going forward.
That's going
We're
forward,
going
so
forward,
let's go.
okay.
Sarah,
Because that's what I was just about to bring up. This brings us to landscapes.
A landscape archaeology, and it actually goes to Spencer Pierce Little, which was really a formative experience for me. Sarah was my TA there, and Carolyn White was out with us one summer doing that. I apologize if I'm forgetting anyone else who was present at the who's here. So we did a field school exchange with Old Sturbridge Village's field school, and we went to one of the sites that they were digging, and they had big features in the middle of the area they were excavating, including a well that was there, and they were like at the end of their excavation, and the well was untouched, and I was like, why have you not looked at these features in the middle of your excavation? And they said, oh, well, we think this is a different period of the farm that we're not really studying right now. And the contrast really just struck me so hard, like, wow, that's like not what we would be doing at Spencer Pierce Little. Like the notion somehow, it struck me as like, what are we on? Like, we're digging for the Roman layer or something? Like, I was like, where are we? Like 1850 and 1870 are being separated, and one we're not interested in? Like, what's going on? Like, it just struck me, and it was so far off from what we were being taught and what we were doing in terms of like, if we were at the farm at Spencer Pierce Little, there was no like, oh, this period is not the period we're looking at. Like the broad landscape and the way that manifested on the ground, there was no like, these features are not the ones we're here for. And it was such a like it was kind of like eyes wide, bulging out moment
Well,
as
yeah.
a student. Yeah.
At Lowell, we didn't find anything to do with the mill girls, and instead we dealt with the late 19th and 20th centuries, because that was what was there, and that was what she always told us was, you gotta look at the archaeology that you're finding, and you can't just put things aside because they're not the period that you thought you were going to find. And that really has come in handier for me than anything else. I mean, I just approach a site as, the archaeological record ends, well, 10 minutes ago. Now, it ends as soon as you dig as soon as you dig the context. That's when the archaeological record ends. So, I mean, that was something fundamental that she imparted to me anyway, that's come in extremely handy, is being able to walk onto a site and say, okay, we don't have the period that we were most interested in. What interests us about the periods that we do have? What can we learn? And
Really interested, Lauren, in your talking a little bit more about the way that all of that has impacted the work that you're doing now on contemporary and environmental response and disaster response and so on.
well, we did a project in California, and I was contracted with FEMA to basically monitor the people who were doing the archaeological monitoring, because I had actually done monitoring at a previous stage. And part of the arrangement that was made to enable the project to go forward was they decided that rather than a situation where they would assess resources and then come back with a determination of whether or not it was potentially eligible, anything of historic date was to be treated as potentially eligible. So I found that by collection that I had in the field of material on 20th century material culture, ceramics and glass, was extremely useful in sort of pointing the consultant on that project in the right direction in a lot of cases, because their tendency was to still say, oh, well, it's more than 50 years old, but we don't really know what to say about it, so we're just not going to, we're not going to consider it at all. And I finally had to write something for them where I said, what you're looking at is you're looking at something from the 20s. You're looking at people who were involved in mass culture, but who were still producing some of their own food. They were still producing, they were using food that wasn't obtained through the commercial networks that we have today, but they were partially involved in that. When you have a canning jar, you've got evidence that people are doing something in that household to produce and conserve food. Yet at the same time, that canning jar was bought with money from a store, and was probably manufactured someplace 1,000 miles away if you're in California. And sort of being able, though, to sort of pull things together to that point, to say to this consultant, this is the way you really should be looking at this. I can only thank Mary for that.
Yeah, so her, obviously her comprehensive approach to historical archaeology was so evident in the way that she viewed landscapes, whether they were small landscapes, large landscapes, that, some of the papers that were in the session, when Travis was talking about St. Mary's City and Krista was talking about Montserrat, there's all these different, not everything was all about landscape, but there was always this touch of different types of interest. And even, Steve Brighton talking about, in Ireland. So you have all these different things that, people have taken and worked with Mary. And I mean, she did so much little bits here, consulting there, it was like constantly, every time I would talk to her, she'd be like, oh, I'm going off here and I'm going to be away over here and I'm working on with this because this is such a great thing to do. But her landscapes, I mean, she would take something and then explore it as long and as far as she could. I mean, whether they were, the landscapes of Spencer Pierce Little, whether it was, in Lowell. I mean,
Yeah.
Steve probably can talk a little bit about Lowell. So since he's joined us,
I have, sorry.
no, I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, we
I'm
were
glad I'm
taking your
here,
name
and
in
it's
vain earlier.
I'm only here because, of course, I picked up my computer. I'm sorry to admit that I totally lost track of time. So, but I think I can tell you all that. So I was sitting down having dinner with my wife, and I picked up my computer and I said, "Oh my God, I have to go now." It says now, but I didn't realize that now was already 30 minutes late. So
That's okay. No. But we did talk a little bit about Lowell. So I know the whether it was an industrial landscape or a farm landscape, she just went for it.
yeah,
I put
well, the best thing to me
I put a
about
few
Lowell
words
is-
in your mouth anyway already, Steve. So
Oh, you did? Okay. Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
it's first, it's nice to see everybody. So I don't know everybody, but I know most of you. But let me say that, it's look, I met Dave there. I met Lauren there. I met so many people in Lowell.
You met me there, but you don't remember me, but I was there.
Well, I must remember. I must remember.
I
you.
was in the back counting glass, so it's okay.
But yeah, I mean, I feel very lucky in my career that there were these projects that I got to participate in, that all the grad students ended up being really successful. I got to work at Jamestown, for example, with a group of African-American women who are now, the top folks in the field. But Lowell was my first real experience with a big pool of graduate students, and they were all Mary's students, So yeah. I mean, it was fun. I'm still working a little in Lowell. I'm trying to do a project right now with Queen's University there. But anyway, that doesn't matter. So, I have to say that for me, it's wonderful to just hear all her students talk about her, because that was the thing about Mary that I can tell you all, because I was like one of her confidants, that boy, she loved her students. She would do anything for her students, that was like such a focus. She was really attached to her sisters. And sadly, they didn't live as long as she did. And so her students became like her family. I know that's sort of standard to say that, but in Mary's case, it was really, really true. So I forget who I just said it to, Karen, when I emailed her to be in this another thing celebrating Mary. She would love this.
Oh, yes.
She would love to see everybody talking about her and saying what she brought to the field, because to me, she's like, you could take her, and that's historical archaeology. I mean, it's not the whole field, but given who she was and the sort of all of you and everybody else, it's like that was a separate school, if you will. And the other thing that, I think I said in my thing, God, wasn't that hard to record that 20-minute thing or whatever it was? I mean, do you know how many copies of that I did? And I just always would get to like the 2-minute point and say, and then just have to stop it anyway. She was unique. She was unique. Mary was unique. That we all are unique, but Mary was that person that I can't think of anybody else that I ever knew who was like Mary. Really, that was, and of course she was a riot, and she loved to gossip, and God, she would say, of course, the funniest things, and not all of those you can. I don't think she would want me to tell you those, but you've all heard them yourselves, right? You've all heard her say something about somebody else. So, yeah.
And if we didn't hear them from Mary, Steve, we heard them from you.
Well, she had
Two of you kibitzing
great
together.
stories. My wife still talks about, because I have a wonderful relationship with my wife, but she hates football and I love football. So that's one, whatever. But Mary, she always quotes Mary, who said, well, you'd have to pay me that much money to play such a stupid game. And that, she said it with such sincerity. You know what I mean? It was just like, it was an analysis that she had conducted, that football was a stupid game, that, so, but yeah, I don't know, She was very unique, standing at the, what do you call it, at the Ting Mansion, and her saying to me, "Oh, look, do you see that little girl standing over there?" And I have to admit that no, I didn't. But that was the first time that I realized that Mary, had believed in an afterlife, and that from time to time thought that she was seeing folks. And I don't doubt that she probably was. I mean, it was nothing I ever experienced, but you got used to that pretty easily. That oh yeah, sure, that was just another part of who she was. But anyway.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
So I think we have a couple more topics we were going to try and touch on a little bit before we conclude tonight. And I think, Karen, we're back to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to segue from some of Steve's comments in his presentation, where he was talking about an evolving, not just multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary approach, which became so characteristic of Mary's practice and interpretation of archaeology that, and we're very comfortable thinking about using documents, using oral history and so forth. But what strikes me about Lowell and the study of landscapes, but then also in terms of food and foodways, is that science becomes part of that interdisciplinary approach, and was so critical in helping us tell the stories of those who are not in the documents. So this topic that I'm supposed to address you on here is about underrepresented populations, minorities, people of color, women, indigenous groups, and so forth. And I guess I'm very struck. I mean, obviously we have traditional resources that we use, but that interdisciplinary approach becomes so critical. And yet, even if we aren't actively trained to be those scientists, I think that a lot of Mary's students really learned to do this intuitively. And I'm thinking of Jade's presentation on the Endicott Street brothel and talking about sex workers. And I'm sure that made Mary so happy. But Laura, you talk about working with descendant communities, and Travis, collaborating with community, collaborating and engaging. And Krista's paper was in part about excavating the enslaved laborers village. So there are a lot of presentations that may not directly talk about the importance of recovering those other voices and listening to them, but I think it's implicit in all of the work that has been presented. So I'm just wondering how you are collecting stories, and have you been able to make people active and objects active? I mean, she talked about artifacts as in the active voice in 1991 in that article with Stephen Lauren. And I think it's, for a lot of us, when we hear active voice, we hear Mary saying, "Do not write in the passive voice ever again." But that's not what we're talking about here. It's making the people active. So does anybody have anything they'd like to share about recovering voices or learning to listen to them?
Well, I will say that I was working on a Pottersfield burying ground where we had, obviously burial trenches with stacks of people in them. And so only a handful of them had an artifact or two that came with it. So I've been right now trying to take that and step beyond. It's very difficult because I don't know who these people are. I just know, woman, in her 30s, pair of earrings, that ended up in the Potter's Field in the 1860s, so I've been thinking about so much about this, especially with Mary, that how to make these unfortunate, 290 people that were buried there, how to give them a voice that goes just beyond, saying that there was 290 people buried in this partially excavated burial trench. So yeah, I've been thinking about it and starting to work on how I'm going to express the handful of them that did have these artifacts with them. One of them actually was a toddler that was probably in a some sort of baptism outfit or something, because it had the little tiny pearl beads around the head, and down the behind it had the little tiny buttons, so they were probably wearing that. And that was one of the few that actually had that kind of artifacts with it. Most of the rest of them had nothing. So it's interesting to now to try and take that and go beyond. So that's one of the things that I'm channeling Mary right now.
Anybody else want to share something?
Certainly, some of the issues here, I'm working with the community of descendants, and the whole community is huge, but those who are interested in archaeology are rather small, right? Because you have to find everybody who actually wants to all the dirt and stuff. But one of the things that's been really fascinating to me, because I started out working with collections. I remember Mary saying, like, no one should do their own dig for their dissertation because they'll never finish. and I was like, oh yeah, I should probably not dig on my own. Okay, I'm going to listen to your advice. But I always thought that was so hard for communities to get connected to, because you're not in the field, and there's sort of that site of experience in the field where you're in that landscape, you're in that place, and you feel connections to people through the place and through the objects and through that process of discovery, and that sort of the novelty of being the first person to touch that, since perhaps your ancestors touched it. But one of the things that a lot of the descendant community, they're like, wait, there are archaeological collections in St. Leonard, Maryland. And so they're so excited. We're doing, in about a month, we're doing a trip to the Mac Lab. And one of the things, is the part of the project we're doing is to develop a website that really features all of these stories. And one of the things that I'm so excited about is to sort of see their take on the stories and see their take on the objects and see what they notice that I don't. Right. Because, like Sarah was talking about, it's so hard to like try and see and envision these stories. And sometimes it's changing the point of view, so it's not just coming from me, right? And so it's such an intricate process, and you start working on a project like this and no one's telling you what to do. And there have been so many times where I'm like, gosh, I wish I could talk to Mary about this, because I'm sure she'd have so many good ideas. And it's just like going at it alone and just trying to figure out and do the best you can.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, I know that recently I've been doing some work with tribal descendant communities. And just, Mary's sense of respect for the people whose archaeology you're doing. I kept thinking of that, because basically in that endeavor, if you, respect goes a long, long way. And to walk onto a site and say to a group of tribal descendants, we have 5 archaeologists here. We will help you look over this property. But if you don't want us to record something, we won't record it. And, to have them say, thank you for being so respectful. We really love your help. But please, we just don't want anything photographed, because some of these things may be funerary items.
Yeah.
And then to successfully do what we need to do. And I think all the time about the way that Mary taught us to respect people rather than position, and how useful that's been.
That's great.
So one of the things that I've learned, working with the Nipmuc who I've been working with for a while now, is that, and it goes to what Lauren just said about respect. It's learning that when I, some of the words that I use that are analytical words, really they find hurtful, like marginalized. They didn't feel marginalized. They don't feel marginalized. The other thing that also brings Mary to mind is the idea that also Lauren talked about, and Dave was talking about, and I'm sure you were all talking about at some point, is that, there's no real difference between the past and the present, that you shouldn't seek to not connect those two. So one of the projects that we're working on now is to repopulate the contemporary landscape with Nipmuc places, and the Nipmuc are participating in this. They're going to bring them to our attention. But one of the great things is, it's just like an example, and it makes me think of Mary so much, because like one of the great places is a bakery in Worcester that was a well-known Nipmuc bakery for 80 years. And that's a place that was really meaningful and continues to be meaningful, even though it's gone. And so, yeah, all of that respect, bringing that. And, I think the reason why that was because, Mary was a very real person. She was an emotional person. She wasn't afraid to share her emotions with you, to be just that. I don't think I ever saw Mary. Well, no, that was a lie. I was going to say I never saw Mary act like, whatever. She could sometimes look at a person, just give them a look, and communicate her feelings about them very clearly. So there's that part. But the respect factor. When we all worked in Lowell, remember the wonderful work she did with the oral histories of the women who were young girls, in the early 20th century. And when I think about that project, there's so many dimensions to it, but that was a real good example. And what Karen was alluding to when we started was, when we were all at Brown, there was this really interesting thing where interdisciplinary research was kind of looked at in a social science, humanities way, not a science way. Really, I think Mary and I both got that later from our, working with Scotty. I got to live with Scotty for a while, so I brought that up. But it was really cool to think of interdisciplinary that way. So folklore, oral history, documentary research. And one of the reasons that in my presentation, I wanted to go talk about Mary's dissertation, because it was so amazingly innovative. And part of it was pure intellect. Part of it was working with Bill Beeman. But part of it also, as I shared with you, is that she was damned that she wasn't going to let a bunch of guys limit her ambitions because they wouldn't let her have access to collections. And I remember when she told me that, and she said, so I'm going to do something that they can't stop me from doing. I'm going to use documents to do the work that I want to do. And that's what she did. And it was so successful and so interesting. And at the time, what I remember most is that everybody had a strange relationship with historians. It was like a love-hate relationship, because historians really didn't have much time for us. I remember going to a session and everybody was talking about working with historians. And finally, the last person was an historian. And he just told everybody, I find your work interesting, but I don't want to work with you because I don't want to work with other people. I became an historian so I could work by myself, and I remember thinking, well, okay. But that kind of interdisciplinary approach is how you teased out these voices of these people. So it's so wonderful to hear that everybody's working with descendant communities and indigenous folks. Obviously, Dave and I, do that a lot in our work, and Krista too. And so if we want to think about that as another extension of Mary, that's a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. So we just have a few more minutes left. I mean, we're kind of going over right now. We're about 10 minutes over. I think there was comparative colonialism. That was the last one to talk about, but I do want to, just in case anybody has to leave, I do want to mention a couple of things, and then if we want to continue to talk, you can. If you do have to leave, I want to say thank you to everybody who came this evening. Thank you to my co-chairs for this session. And I want to say thank you to everyone who presented or gave a paper and put it up on YouTube, et cetera, for this session. It's really a true testament to Mary's influence with her students, with her colleagues, and just over her influence over the scholarship in historical archaeology. So we will be in touch as we move on with our exploration of a book in her honor, and we will be in touch with all of you as well as others. So I do want to say that before we went back, just in case anybody did have to leave, because we are at that hour mark. So.
I think Karen also wanted to update us on some other opportunities to celebrate Mary's career that are coming up at BU.
Oh, okay. There is a symposium being organized for April 30th, which is a Saturday. It's in the afternoon. And this is the second of two symposia in Mary's honor, sponsored by the different programs, her different academic homes at BU, of which there were quite a few. And this second symposium is going to be, there is a face-to-face component, but there is going to be a virtual attendance for people who can't travel. And the first part involves 5 speakers from the disciplines of gastronomy and culinary arts, archaeology, anthropology, history, museum studies, women's studies. I think I've probably forgotten a few, but they're talking about Mary's influence in their disciplines, but also at the points of intersection. So going back to this theme of multi and interdisciplinary approaches. And so I think it's going to be a really excellent opportunity to reflect on those areas that were so important to Mary in her research. There are going to be some panelists who reflect on Mary's influence on their careers and their research directions as well, and a reception, and we're collecting photos and videos. So I am hopeful that in the next week or so, we will finally be able to start sharing the link for the registration site and provide more information about it. But I did want to let you know about that, and stay tuned.
Thanks, Karen. So our last topic we labeled comparative colonialism, but I really think of it as Mary's place in the international arena of scholarship, which is certainly in part comparative. The work that she did in the Outer Hebrides, the work she did in Montserrat and Bermuda, and her impact on even the archaeology of Antarctica. And I'm really delighted to see that Andres has been able to join us during the course of our conversation this evening. And I was hoping maybe, Andres, that you would talk a little bit more about Mary's international impact, and especially the place of her work in the development of Latin American archaeology and of the archaeology projects that you've been doing in Antarctica.
Thank you, Luan. And first of all, I'm very sorry because I have not now that I make some confusions with the time and I arrive a little, an hour late. So I'm very sorry. I was watching most of the presentation and I found them very interesting. Especially, I enjoy the ones that talks about everyday aspect of Mary's life, how she was, how she thought, how she, what things she liked, and all those stories telling by people that have shared a lot of their life together, like Steve Morsovsky, Adrian Pretzelis, Susan Spencer Wood, and several others. also I enjoy a lot and agree with the idea that was created with Mary, like a feminist woman, a very intelligent, with a sharp intelligence, with a very special sense of humor, with these gossips that I like to think like the stories of historical archaeology, telling in a very different way. So for us in Latin America, Mary was really a special person, very very open to all of us, and of course also as a brilliant academic that gave us possibilities to discuss several aspects, as like to give voice to people without history, intimacy economies, the relation among material culture and historical documents, and so many things that I think are really right now like using by most of my colleagues in Latin America. So Mary Beaudry is not only an American archaeologist, but a very world international known woman archaeology. That's also important because, as you know, when most of the people think in archaeology, even inside of archaeology, you think in Binford, Hodder, Mark Leone, and several others that are men. And in this case, Mary, as a historical archaeology woman, has really enlightened most of historical archaeologist practitioners in South America.
Well, thank you, Andrew, so much. And what a great way to end our discussion tonight. Thank all of you for participating, as Sarah said, and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.